You wake up on a cold January morning in the year 1348. You don't know it yet, but you are living inside the most catastrophic single year in the history of human civilization. The village outside your window, a cluster of timber-framed houses pressed together along a muddy lane somewhere in central France, is about to be hollowed out. Not by war, not by famine, not by any enemy you can see or name or run from, by something smaller than a grain of sand, carried on the back of a flea, riding in the fur of a rat, slipping silently through the walls of every home in Europe. The Black Death has arrived, and before it is done, it will kill somewhere between a third and half of every living person on this continent. Historians still debate the precise death toll. Estimates range from 25 million to as many as 50 million in Europe alone, with global figures sometimes cited as high as 200 million when accounting for Asia and the Middle East. But what no historian debates is this: nothing in recorded human history comes close to what 1348 did to the world. But before the plague reaches your door, let us understand the world you actually live in, because the medieval peasant of 1348 was not a cartoon figure in a storybook. They were a person. They had a name, a family, a daily routine, a set of fears and hopes that, when you strip away the centuries, sound startlingly familiar. You wake before dawn. There is no alarm, but your body knows. The light through the oiled parchment of your window, real glass is for churches and nobles, shifts from black to gray, and that is enough. Your house is a single room, or perhaps two if your family is among the more prosperous village craftsmen. The floor is packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or dried herbs to manage the smell. You share this space with your wife, your children, possibly an elderly parent, and depending on the season, perhaps a goat or a few chickens, because in winter, the warmth of animals is not a luxury. It is survival. There is a central hearth, no chimney in many homes, so the smoke from last night's fire still hangs in the air. You breathe it every day. Your lungs are never truly clean. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a small piece of dark rye bread, maybe some pottage left from the night before, a thick stew of grains and whatever root vegetables you managed to store through autumn. There is no coffee, no sugar, no spice unless you live near a trade route and can afford the merchant's price, which you almost certainly cannot. Meat is a luxury reserved for feast days and the tables of your lord. You eat what the earth gives you, and in 1348, the earth has not been generous. Europe has only just recovered from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, a catastrophe that starved millions and left entire generations physically weakened. Historian William Chester Jordan, in his landmark study of that famine, described a Europe that entered the mid-14th century already fragile, already leaning against a wall that was slowly crumbling. You do not know the word fragile, but your body knows it. You are shorter than your ancestors were 2 centuries ago. Your teeth are worn. You are, statistically, unlikely to live past your mid-40s. You step outside. The village is beginning to stir. You are a serf, or perhaps a free peasant. The distinction matters enormously to you, even if it seems subtle from the outside. A serf is bound to the land of his lord, owing labor several days a week on the lord's fields before he can tend his own strips. A free peasant pays rent, often in grain or coin, and has somewhat more control over his movements. Either way, you are at the bottom of a rigid social pyramid that the church calls the 3 orders: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. You work. You have always worked. Your father worked. His father worked. The expectation that this will ever change has simply never entered your mind, because the medieval worldview does not imagine social mobility the way we do today. God placed you here. God will judge you here. And until that judgment, you plow. The village itself is a living organism with its own rhythms and rules. There are perhaps 30 to 50 families clustered around a central green, a well, and the stone parish church whose bell tower is the tallest structure most of you will ever see up close. The church is not just a place of worship. It is the courthouse, the community hall, the hospital, the school, and the psychological anchor of every life in this village. The priest, father whatever his name is probably not a theologian. He may not even be entirely literate beyond the Latin phrases he has memorized for Mass. But he baptizes your children, hears your confession, blesses your fields, and will say the prayers over your body when you die. He is the most powerful man most peasants ever personally interact with, and in 1348, he is about to be tested beyond anything his faith prepared him for. Beyond the village lie the open fields, vast, communally managed strips of land divided among the villagers according to ancient custom. You might work 3 or 4 strips scattered across different fields to balance out the good soil and the poor. It is an inefficient system by modern standards, but it is also a community system, one where neighbors share oxen, share labor during harvest, and share the risk of a bad year. And there have been many bad years. The weather in 14th century Europe was shifting. The medieval warm period that had allowed agriculture to expand into northern latitudes was giving way to what historians now call the Little Ice Age, a long, gradual cooling that shortened growing seasons, increased crop failures, and pushed populations that had grown fat on a century of good harvests back toward the edge of survival. You feel this in your bones every winter. You feel it in the thinness of your children. Now imagine it is spring. The fields need plowing. You and your ox, if you are lucky enough to own a share of one, move through the dark earth in long, slow passes. You will do this for weeks. Your hands will blister and crack and callous. You will pray to Saint Isidore the farmer, patron of agricultural workers, because prayer is not separate from labor in your world. It is woven into it. You cross yourself when you begin the furrow. You say a blessing over the seed. You are not superstitious in the modern sense of the word. You are operating within a complete and coherent cosmology in which the physical and the spiritual are one continuous reality. When the harvest fails, it is not just an agricultural disaster, it is a message. From God, from the saints, from the alignment of forces you do not fully understand but deeply respect. And it is exactly this cosmology that will make the arrival of the plague so psychologically devastating. The disease that would come to be called the Black Death, though that specific term was not widely used until centuries later. Contemporaries more often called it the Great Pestilence or the Great Mortality, originated far to the east. Modern genetic research, including work published by scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, has traced the pathogen Yersinia pestis to reservoirs in Central Asia, likely in or around the region of modern-day Kyrgyzstan, where mass grave sites dating to the late 1330s show a striking cluster of deaths attributed in contemporary inscriptions to a pestilence. From there, along the arteries of the Mongol trade network, the Silk Road in all its various branches, the disease moved west. It reached the Crimean Peninsula by 1346, where a Genoese trading post at Kaffa on the Black Sea became one of the critical transmission points. The Florentine chronicler Gabriele de Mussis, though he may not have been a direct eyewitness, recorded the story of Mongol forces besieging Kaffa and catapulting the bodies of plague victims over the city walls, possibly one of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare, though historians debate how significant this was to the actual spread. When the Genoese traders fled by ship, they carried the plague with them. Rats carried it too, in the holds of ships, feeding on the grain stores, their fleas hopping to new hosts as the ships docked at Messina, in Sicily, in October of 1347. From Sicily, it spread to Sardinia, Corsica, Genoa, Pisa. By early 1348, it is burning through Italy, Florence, Venice, Rome. By summer, it is in France. By autumn, it is in England, arriving at the port of Weymouth in Dorset sometime around June of 1348, according to most historians, though the exact date remains a subject of scholarly discussion. Back in your village, you have not heard about Sicily. You have not heard about Kaffa. News travels at the speed of a walking horse, and even then it travels in fragments, distorted by rumor and interpretation. What you have heard, through a merchant passing through a pilgrim on his way to a shrine, through the priest who heard something from the bishop's representative, is that somewhere to the south and east, a terrible sickness is killing people. But terrible sicknesses are not unusual in your world. People die of dysentery every summer. Smallpox visits every generation. Tuberculosis, which you call consumption, is a slow, familiar thief. You have buried children before. You will bury more. Death is not a stranger in 1348. It lives in your house, You know its face. What you do not know is that this time, death has changed its face entirely. The plague comes in three forms, though you will not understand this medically. The most common is bubonic plague, spread by flea bites, characterized by the sudden appearance of swellings, buboes, in the lymph nodes of the groin, armpit, or neck. These swellings can grow to the size of an egg or even an apple, hard and agonizing. The Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence and wrote about it in the introduction to his Decameron, described these swellings with clinical precision, noting that they were followed by black and purple spots appearing on the arms and thighs and other parts of the body. He wrote that almost all who developed these signs died within 3 days, though some lasted a little longer. Death rates for untreated bubonic plague run roughly between 30 and 60%. But there are also the pneumonic and septicemic forms, one attacking the lungs directly, spread through respiratory droplets, the other entering the bloodstream so rapidly that victims could die before visible symptoms even appeared. Pneumonic plague is nearly always fatal without treatment. Septicemic plague kills even faster. And you in 1348 have no treatment. You have no understanding of bacteria. You have no understanding of bacteria. You have no understanding of bacteria. No public health infrastructure of any kind that can respond to something moving this fast. When it arrives in your village, it arrives without announcement. Perhaps a traveler who stopped at the inn near the mill for a single night, perhaps a rat from a merchant's cart, perhaps a neighbor who visited the market town a day's walk away and came back feverish. The exact mechanism does not matter because you cannot see it. What you see is this. Your neighbor's wife falls ill on a Tuesday. By Friday she is dead. Her husband develops a swelling under his arm on Saturday. He is dead by Monday. Their eldest son, who helped carry the body to the churchyard, he is feverish by Wednesday. You watch this happen from across the lane. You do not know what to do. Nobody does. The responses to the plague across Europe were varied and often desperate. The physicians of the era, trained in Galenic humoral theory, the idea that illness resulted from imbalances in the 4 bodily humors, recommended bloodletting, purging, special diets, and the burning of aromatic herbs to cleanse the air of what they called miasma, the corrupted air believed to carry disease. The Paris medical faculty, consulted by King Philip VI of France in 1348, issued a formal report attributing the pestilence to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the house of Aquarius that had occurred in 1345, releasing corrupted vapors from the earth. This was not ignorance in the contemptible sense. It was the most sophisticated medical reasoning available to the 14th century, and these were learned men doing their genuine best. But their best could not touch what was happening. Physicians who entered sick rooms died. Priests who administered last rites died. The very act of compassion became a death sentence. You watch the church fill with the dying. You watch Father, let us call him Father Pierre, move from bed to bed with his oils and his prayers, his face pale, his hands trembling. He knows what is coming for him. He keeps going anyway. This is not nothing. When the chronicler Henry Knighton, an Augustinian canon writing in Leicester, described the plague sweeping through English towns, he noted with particular horror that priests were dying so rapidly that the dying were left without spiritual comfort, a terror in that era as acute as the physical suffering, because dying without confession and last rites meant the soul's fate was uncertain. The fear of death in the 14th century was not just fear of physical pain, it was fear of hell, of purgatory, of the accounting that awaited the unshriven soul. The plague did not just kill bodies, it threatened the architecture of salvation itself. Some people fled. Boccaccio describes Florentines abandoning their own family members, leaving the sick alone with their suffering, evacuating the city for country villas where they attempted to wait out the storm with wine and story and enforced cheerfulness, which is precisely the frame of his entire Decameron. 100 stories told by 10 young people who have fled Florence and are amusing themselves in a garden while the world dies. The act of storytelling as a response to catastrophe. The act of maintaining beauty and wit in the face of dissolution. There is something very human in that. Others responded with penitence. The flagellant movement. Groups of men who moved from town to town publicly whipping themselves as acts of collective repentance, believing the plague was divine punishment for human sin, spread rapidly through Germany and the Low Countries beginning in 1348. They drew crowds. They were initially tolerated and even praised by some local clergy. Pope Clement VI, watching from Avignon, eventually condemned the movement in 1349, but by then the flagellants had become a destabilizing force, and in some cases a dangerous one, particularly in their relationship to the persecution of Jewish communities. This is among the darkest chapters of the plague's history and must be addressed directly. Across much of Western and Central Europe in 1348 and 1349, Jewish communities were accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells. This accusation had no basis in fact. It was a product of fear, scapegoating, and pre-existing anti-Semitism that the catastrophe of the plague inflamed to genocidal extremes. Jewish populations in cities, including Strasbourg, Mainz, Cologne, and hundreds of smaller communities, were massacred. In Strasbourg in February of 1349, approximately 2,000 Jewish residents were murdered, many burned alive. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls explicitly stating that Jewish people were not responsible for the plague and ordering their protection, noting that the plague was killing Jewish communities just as it was killing everyone else. But these proclamations were largely ignored in the most affected regions. The historian Samuel Cohn and others who have studied these pogroms in depth describe them as one of the most devastating episodes of anti-Semitic violence in European history, prior to the 20th century. It is important to name this clearly. These were atrocities, committed by people driven to murderous scapegoating by a catastrophe they could not understand or control. The victims deserve to be remembered as victims. Meanwhile, in your village, the priest is dead. 2 of your children are sick. You have not slept properly in 2 weeks. The person who was collecting the dead, the gravedigger, old Thomas, who had outlived everyone's expectations already, he is gone too. Bodies are being laid in long trenches because there are simply not enough people left to dig individual graves. You try to remember the last time you felt normal. It was not long ago, and yet it feels like another life. The economic and social consequences of this catastrophe were, in the long run, paradoxical. Historians like David Herlihy, in his influential work on the Black Death, and more recently Bruce Campbell in his study of the 14th century crisis, have traced how the massive die-off of labor created, over the following decades, a strange and terrible gift to the survivors. When half the workforce is gone, the survivors can demand higher wages. They can move to better land, because there is suddenly more land available than there are people to work it. The rigid social hierarchies of medieval feudalism, the structures that kept your grandfather bound to a particular lord's fields his entire life, began to crack. Peasants in England rose up in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, demanding an end to serfdom. The labor shortages created by the plague were a contributing, if not sole cause. The old world was not destroyed in a year, but the cracks that opened in 1348 never fully closed. You do not know any of this sitting in your house in 1348. You do not know that you are a hinge of history. You only know that the man who lived 3 doors down, who you argued with once about a boundary fence, and who lent you his ox last spring when yours was lame, is gone. That the woman who helped your wife during her last labor is gone. That the sound of the village, the constant low hum of children, animals, tools, voices, has gone quiet in a way that feels like a held breath that will never be released. The silence of a depopulated village in the autumn of 1348 was something contemporary chroniclers struggled to convey. The Welsh poet Juan Gethin, who may have died of plague himself before finishing his lament, wrote of the shilling of death, of a rootless phantom that cuts down the young and does not spare the old. The Italian writer Petrarch, who lost his beloved Laura to the plague in 1348, wrote to a friend that when has any such thing been seen or heard of, houses left vacant, cities abandoned, fields left untended, corpses left lying without anyone to mourn them. He was not exaggerating. He was reporting. The church that emerged from 1348 was a changed institution. It had lost enormous numbers of clergy. Many of the replacements were poorly trained and quickly ordained to fill the gaps, which contributed to a perception of clerical inadequacy that fed into the reforming movements of the coming century. The mystical movements that flourished in the plague's aftermath, devotions like the Ars Moriendi, the art of dying well, and the dance of death imagery that spread across European church walls, reflected a culture permanently altered in its relationship to mortality. The figure of death as a skeletal dancer pulling kings and peasants alike into the same grave became one of the central artistic motifs of the late medieval period. Nobody is exempt. Nobody is protected by rank or wealth or piety. Death comes for the Pope in Avignon, and in 1348, it very nearly did, forcing Clement VI to retreat into isolation, sitting between two large fires he hoped would purify the air around him. Some villages simply vanished. Across England, France, Germany, and Italy, there are what archaeologists call deserted medieval villages, settlements that were depopulated by the plague and never recovered, eventually reclaimed by fields and forests. In England alone, historians estimate somewhere between a third and half of all settlements experienced significant population loss, and many hundreds were abandoned entirely. You walk through a wood today in rural England or France, and you might be walking through what was once someone's home, someone's whole world, their market, their church, their lane, their life. Gone so completely that only a faint rise in the earth, detectable from aerial photography, suggests that anyone was ever there. The plague did not end in 1348. It returned in 1361, in 1369, in 1374, and in wave after wave across the following century. Some of these later waves were particularly lethal to children who had not been exposed during the first wave and had no inherited resistance. The Europe that emerged from this prolonged catastrophe by the early 15th century was perhaps a third smaller in population than the Europe of 1340. It would not recover to pre-plague population levels until approximately 1500, and in some regions even later. The world that built the Renaissance, that launched the Age of Exploration, that produced Leonardo and Gutenberg and Columbus, that world was built by the survivors of one of the worst biological catastrophes our species has ever experienced. The trauma was so deep and so pervasive that it reshaped theology, art, philosophy, medicine, labor relations, and the very structure of European society. We are, in ways we rarely acknowledge, still living in the world the plague remade. You, in your silent village in the autumn of 1348, could not have known that. You only knew the grief of immediate loss, the terror of what was still coming, the exhaustion of keeping yourself and whoever remained of your family alive through another day. Perhaps you sat in the doorway of your house as the evening came on, watching the sun set over fields that needed to be harvested and might not be, listening to a silence where there used to be sound, and felt something that had no name in any language of your era, but that we might recognize immediately. A grief so large it had no container, a before and an after, and no map for how to cross between.